Hello, I'm Linda Elder. Welcome to this presentation in which I will be focusing on the foundations of critical thinking. The title of my presentation is Advancing Critical Thinking Throughout Education and Across the Professions, in every classroom, in every country, in the world. We could go further into say in every profession, in every business, in every family, in every part of human life. I'm going to focus on the fundamentals of critical thinking in a very brief introduction. And what this means is that I will not be able to get into contextualizations within your field. I will leave it up to you to do this. What I am going to do is to help you begin to see the toolbox of critical thinking, or to better see it, so that you can better use it in your classrooms with students and in every part of your life. You can take essentially one of two core theoretical approaches to critical thinking. The first is what is typically done, and that is through an emphasis on critical thinking skills and abilities, often reduced to thinking skills. And the second, and the approach that we use, is through the development of intellectual and ethical character, which we see as at the heart of critical thinking. Now, to give you a sense of these two different approaches, here you see 35 dimensions of thought, and here we're going to see skills and abilities embedded in these dimensions. And there are more. This is a beginning place. Here you see thinking independently under affective dimensions, the first category. Developing insight into egocentricity and sociocentricity. Well, you should see right away that this is going beyond the typical emphasis on skills and abilities, which we see here under cognitive dimensions, micro skills. For example, comparing and contrasting ideals, thinking precisely about thinking, noting similarities and differences. These, of course, are important, but we've got to go beyond this to focus on the development of intellectual character, intellectual virtues, unpack what we mean by this. And here are some of the core intellectual virtues at the heart of a substantive conception of critical thinking. This is an important piece in our approach to critical thinking. What we want, in other words, is not to develop students who can simply identify relevant information. You see how that's a micro skill? Gather information, state their purpose. These are important. But what is more important is whether they are living, whether our students are living in accordance with intellectual character or virtues. For example, to what degree do they embody intellectual humility? To what degree are they able to recognize the difference between what they do understand and what they do not understand? To what degree do they even care whether someone else agrees with them, or whether they are able to think within other points of view? And now I'm getting into intellectual empathy. So we have intellectual humility, the ability to distinguish between what we know, what we do not know. Intellectual empathy, the propensity to think within points of view that are different from our own, or points of view that we've never considered, and even points of view that we disagree with. So these are two of the intellectual virtues we would want our students to embody. We want them to have intellectual autonomy, to be able to stand on their own 2 feet, and in terms of their thinking. In other words, we want them to be able to stand alone with their beliefs as long as they are thinking critically about the things to, that they're that they're standing alone about. So we don't want them to just say, well, I'm going to be different and I'm not going to agree. No, that's not the point. The point is, have you thought something through critically? And if you have, are you willing to stand alone in your beliefs when the crowd may be against you? That's very unusual. It's hard to do, and it's often the case that people who do this are ostracized by others in society. To what degree are the students able to persevere through issues, problems, complexities? To what degree do they give up easily, or instead keep moving through these difficulties until they find answers? To what degree do they have the courage to look into their own beliefs, intellectual courage? And there are others. These are some of the most important intellectual virtues that have been handed to us through the history of ideas over time, and that we have also contributed to. Now, so we want our students to develop these. We've got to find ways to help them develop these, and we want them to then, therefore, not embody the opposites of these traits. And you see the opposites here, the ones that I just was focusing on. So the opposite of intellectual humility, which I was talking about before, is intellectual arrogance. Intellectual arrogance means that we think we already know enough, we don't need to know more, we're not open to hearing other sides of an argument, our minds are shutting down. And all of us engage in this way of thinking. All of us sometimes think that we know more than we do know, and we've got to push against that if we want to develop as critical thinkers. The opposite of intellectual integrity, intellectual hypocrisy. Saying one thing and doing something else. Saying one thing and meaning something else. Intellectual conformity, the opposite of intellectual autonomy. We want our students to, again, have intellectual perseverance rather than being intellectually lazy. We want them to be fair instead of being unfair. And you can see the other examples. So what we need to do is to teach these concepts explicitly to our students so they have a chance to internalize them and to apply them to their own thinking and to develop their character in the direction of fair-minded critical thinking. So there isn't a way to teach intellectual virtues other than teaching them. And of course, we don't have time to get into instructional design, but one thing that we can do to develop intellectual empathy, for example, is have students reading within the thinking of other people. So, in other words, reading an article, reading a book, and then role-playing the thinking of the author of that written work. That is something that we can bring into the classroom on a regular basis. So now what we want then in the long run is to develop what our founder Richard Paul termed strong sense critical thinkers, and he coined this term in the 1980s. And by this he means fair-minded critical thinkers, skilled thinkers characterized predominantly by these traits: the ability and tendency to question deeply one's own views, and to reconstruct sympathetically and imaginatively the strongest versions of viewpoints and perspectives opposed to one's own. The ability and tendency to reason dialectically, multilogically, in such a way as to determine when one's own point of view is at its weakest and when an opposing viewpoint is at its strongest. So a critical thinker is looking to embody these traits and is not trying to avoid them or acting in bad faith. The ability and propensity to change one's thinking when the evidence would require it, without regard to one's own selfish or vested interests. Now, this is a very big point, and the opposite of it is a big problem in human life. So, people are often selfish, and in groups, they often are focused on their vested interests, and therefore, in those cases, they often do not want to see the evidence that would require them to see their behavior and their thinking in a more accurate light. So we want to develop strong sense critical thinking, and we want to avoid weak sense critical thinking. And all of us sometimes are weak sense critical thinkers, and hopefully sometimes strong sense critical thinkers. So weak sense critical thinkers are those who use skills and abilities to some degree, but mainly to serve their selfish interests, and are often unfair or unethical thinkers. They have these tendencies. They do not hold themselves or those with whom they ego-identify to the same intellectual standards to which they hold their opponents. And they do not reason empathically within points of view or frames of reference with which they disagree. So this is what we want to avoid, and what we want to encourage is the opposite. And again, weak sense critical thinkers tend to think monologically within a narrow viewpoint. So they may be good at thinking within a field, but not more broadly. A very good engineer, highly skilled in that, but not so skilled as a parent or as a person who is thinking in terms of civic responsibility. And they tend to use intellectual skills selectively and self-deceptively to foster and serve, again, their selfish interests, often ignoring the truth. And each of us needs to think about the degree to which we are strong sense or weak sense critical thinkers. And weak sense critical thinkers also use critical thinking skills to identify flaws in the reasoning of others, and sophisticated arguments to refute others' arguments before giving those arguments due consideration. They justify their irrational thinking through highly sophisticated rationalizations. They're highly skilled at manipulation. So again, this is what we want our students to avoid, and we want to move them toward fair-minded critical thinking where they are concerned with the rights and needs of others while also pursuing their own desires, and they want to help create a more rational world. So here is moving forward then to some other of the concepts in critical thinking. We focused a little bit on intellectual virtues, and what I can do is give you an overview of the concepts in our approach that are at the core of our approach. And of course, there are many other concepts that emanate out from these. But to give you a sense of the overview, I've just focused on the center of this, the cultivation of intellectual traits, virtues, dispositions, or, in other words, intellectual character. And above that, we see the assessment of thought and the analysis of thought. I'll be getting into each of these very briefly. So if we're going to think critically, want to cultivate these traits, how do we do this? Well, to some extent, by understanding what's involved in reasoning and then applying intellectual standards to reasoning in order to properly assess the reasoning that we're doing. And then we have to be concerned with the problems that run across human life, and those are the problems of egocentric and sociocentric thinking. These are complicated concepts, but they're actually simple in terms of their core meanings. Egocentric thinking, meaning selfishness or intellectual arrogance, stuck in your way of thinking, unable to get outside of your way of thinking, being narrow-minded. And then sociocentric thinking as group selfishness, or what I term groupishness. So that's looking out for my group, but not being concerned about the broader picture for the human species, for the country, for all countries, and for all people. So these are this is the core, and of course, we need to understand that not only are we focusing on thinking, but thinking is related to feelings and desires. So that is also theory that we would need to cover if we were going to spend more time on this introduction. So for our purposes here, I'm going to burrow in a bit to these concepts, having begun already with the focus on the cultivation of intellectual traits, or the centerpiece here. You can think of your mind as continually figuring things out. Now, maybe continually is not the best word, maybe routinely, because you're not always figuring things out, but you are very often figuring things out as you move through your day. And you've got to figure things out as you drive down the road or ride the subway or whatever you're doing. You've got things coming at you, and you've got to figure them out. If you're on the computer, if you're dealing with anything having to do with the internet, things are coming at you. What sense are you making of those things is the question. And the sense that you're making of those things has to do with the reasoning that you're doing in your mind as you're observing or dealing with the situations that are coming at you or that you are creating. So what this means is that reasoning, which is the way we figure things out fundamentally through the mind, reasoning is at the heart of the human animal. And yet it is fundamentally ignored. And almost all theory of critical thinking is fundamentally ignored in human societies as we stand today. Now, there are bits and pieces of it here and there, and you'll see that as we move forward. That is, you'll see that you know some of these concepts, and they connect with some idea that somebody that you read about in some book. But these ideas are coming to us often in an unintegrated way. And so we don't see the patterns. We don't have a system for reasoning at a higher level, or a system for opening reasoning that we are all using as a species. So what we're arguing for is the lingua of critical thinking, the language of critical thinking. And if you are involved in teaching languages, then you know that this is not an easy thing to do. But all of us need to be using, in any language that we're speaking, the tools of critical thinking. So now we're looking through our minds at situations. We're also creating situations, and we do this through the elements of reasoning. And when we are opening up reasoning, we need then criteria to assess that reasoning, and that criteria falls under the category of what we call intellectual standards. So the elements of reasoning can be seen in a circle. And what this means is that whenever you reason, no matter what you're reasoning about or what you're reasoning through, or what age you are, or how well you reason, or how smart you are or think you are, whenever you reason, you're using these elements. You cannot avoid using them. You may not be aware that you're using them, but you are using them. They may be functioning at the unconscious level, which they often are, but you're still using them. So when you are teaching, you have purposes and you're asking questions, you're using information to decide how to put together your teaching strategies, you're coming to conclusions about that information, you are developing concepts that will guide your instruction. These will be directly connected with your assumptions and also connected directly to your point of view. And all of this leads to implications and consequences or consequences. So what we want is to understand that wherever there is reasoning, these parts are present. Whether you're reading a book, an article, an essay, a cartoon, listening to music, all of these are products of reasoning. Somebody had to do some reasoning in order to come to these conclusions, and the better their reasoning, the better they usually function living in the complex world that we live in today. So we need to know how to take our own thinking apart and to take apart the thinking of others. And we need to be able to, once we do this, then assess thinking, again, using universal intellectual standards. And I'll come back to those in a few minutes, but you see a few of them at the bottom of this diagram. Clarity, accuracy, precision, relevance, depth, breadth, significance. So we can say, what is your purpose? Are you clear about your purpose? What are your questions? Are you clear about your questions? What information are you using? Is it accurate? Is it relevant? Is it significant? Is it sufficient? So these are moves that we learn to make when we study critical thinking explicitly. The elements of reasoning come out of this understanding. If you can read the diagram at the top, whenever we think for a purpose, within a point of view, based on assumptions, leading to implications and consequences. We use data, facts, and experiences to make inferences and judgments based on concepts and theories to answer a question or solve a problem. You see the 8 elements there in a slightly different format. And when we understand the top circle, we can understand the second. If I understand that whenever I think for a purpose, then there should be only one step to this question: what is my purpose right now? And I need to be asking that much more often than we typically do in human life. If I always think within a point of view, then I can ask this question: what is my point of view right now as I'm reasoning through this issue? If all of our reasoning is based on assumptions, then I can ask, what am I assuming right now? So you can go through the rest of the wheel and get the idea. So when we understand the elements of reasoning, there are many questions that we can ask and should be asking based on those elements. There are many ways to apply these elements once you understand them. Here is one way. This is a template that is often used with students in classrooms where faculty are advancing understanding of the elements of thought. Note the simplicity and note the details. We can take an essay, an article, a chapter, and we can have our students do this again and again. We can ask them, what is the main purpose of the article? In number 1, the main purpose is. Number 2, the key question or questions the author is addressing is or are as follows. What is the most important information in the article? Number 3, what are the main inferences? Number 4, and number 5, what are the main concepts? You know we're going to have the 8, so what are the main assumptions that the author is making? If we take this line of thinking seriously, number 7, what are some implications that will follow? And finally, what is the point of view from which you are looking at this, and how are you seeing it? When our students go through this practice again and again, they come to understand the logic of whatever it is that they're reading, in a much more deep way. You can also take the same elements, apply them to the logic of a question, the logic of a problem, the logic of questions emerging from the problem. We start by asking the question, what is the problem? Detail that. What is the key question that emerges from that? What is my purpose in addressing it? Again, having our students do this multiple times so that they learn the concepts in critical thinking and the language of critical thinking. We want them to internalize that. The only way they're going to do that is if they have considerable practice in this. So we've talked about the cultivation of intellectual traits. We spent a little bit of time on the analysis of thought. Now let's move to the second point in the circle, the assessment of thought. So once we take our thinking apart and we have the elements, we ask ourselves, well, now that I know what my purpose is and I can state what my question is, and I know what the concepts are that I'm using, or I'm reading an article and I can state what the purpose is, I think I know what the questions are that the author is asking, and I'm pretty sure this is the information. So once the student has done that, the question is, how do they then judge the quality of the reasoning? We judge the quality of reasoning through universal intellectual standards. Notice the simplicity here, and here are some of the essential intellectual standards that we all should be using on a regular basis to develop our thinking. Clarity, accuracy, precision, relevance, depth, breadth, logic, significance, and fairness. And there you see a brief definition of each one. And once we have internalized intellectual standards, one part of that internalization is understanding the questions that emerge from our understanding of that standard. So if I understand clarity in thinking, that it's important in thinking, and I know what it means, then I will routinely make certain intellectual moves such as this. I don't understand what you just said. Can you say that in other words? I didn't use the word clarity. I could have said, I'm not clear on what you said. Can you say that in other words? I didn't say that, but I meant that. And it's obvious when I say, can you say that in other words? Can you give me an example? Or let me tell you what I understand you to be saying. Is that correct? These are, again, all intellectual moves our students need to learn to make and make on a regular basis, in and out of the classroom. Accuracy. Somebody brings up some information and is trying to prove a point through that information. My question might be, how do you know that's accurate? Where are you getting your evidence? What is your evidence? Or how's that relevant to the question that we're focusing on? We want our students to be able to be precise in their use of language. This is very important, and as we all know, we're moving away from precision of thought historically, not more toward precision of thought. When we bring in precision, we're asking for more details. We're asking you to unpack your thoughts. We're asking you to tell us more about what you think. And now with texting and the shortening of language, and we're going more and more to the concise. So say it as simply as possible, tweet it out in one sentence, and this is not going to lead us to the cultivation of critical thinking, because thinking frequently requires us to take apart our thinking and to give more details, and again to unpack, to give specifics. This is precision. Relevance is another very important intellectual standard, and it's very obvious, I think, what that means. If it's relevant, it's directly related to the situation or answering the question. And often our students are bringing in ideas that are not relevant, or we ourselves are, maybe in meetings and other places. And when we're thinking critically, somebody will say, How is that relevant to what we're focusing on here? It's a good question. It's a significant question, but I don't see the relevance. And somebody may say, well, here's how it's relevant. Okay, well, good, then I see that now. Or I'm not really seeing that. So we've got to use this language again explicitly so that we can practice understanding the language itself and developing our understanding of how we can better use it. Depth is required when a situation is complex. So we take the problem of sustainability. It's a highly complex question as to how we can best sustain the Earth's resources. There is only a way that we're going to answer that, and that's through dealing with all of its complexities. And breadth is required when there's more than one point of view that is relevant. And so we know that many of the problems facing humans today are broad and face us all, and like a worldwide pandemic where everyone is potentially frightened by a virus that's spreading across the world. So we've got to think broadly, considering multiple points of view when dealing with many of the problems that we face. Logic, another important intellectual standard. Do the parts fit together? Do they logically flow? Does this idea that you're using relate to this other idea that you're using? If so, show me the connection, the logical connection. We want our students to ask the question, is that logical? Does that seem right? It may be logical and it may be accurate, but it may not seem quite like we can accept it. And in those cases, we want our students to dig a little further, or to at least withhold judgment. I'm not really sure. I need to think about this. Significance. Many people in the world are focused on the trivial. They're focused on what is really not significant in the long term. And this is unfortunate because human life is something that we should be celebrating and something that we should be enjoying and something that we should be advancing. But to do all those things, we also want to achieve at the highest levels that we can. And to do that, we need to focus on what is significant. And achievement means different things to different people. And so what I'm saying is that there are the important things in life that we want to connect with, and those are the things that are should be our primary focus, and not our clothing and our hairstyle and whether we have the newest and latest vehicle or whatever trivial ideas are pulling us away from the important things that we want to be focusing on. And then, of course, fairness is an essential intellectual standard, because where another point of view is relevant, the critical thinker will think about that viewpoint and will fully consider it in good faith, not to dismiss it, but to hear it. And the fact is that humans have never really valued fair-mindedness as a social goal across human societies. That's not where we are quite yet. There are many people who do see the importance and are working toward it, but it's not a standard that we naturally want to adhere to in many cases, and we have to work toward that, toward being fair to everyone involved. So you can take the elements, the standards, and the traits together. They form a framework for thinking that enables you to think through any field of study. And these are just some examples that could be added to this list, but this is an unlimited list that could be created. So, in other words, we use our knowledge of the elements of reasoning, intellectual standards, and intellectual virtues to reason through any field of study, any part of human life that we are focusing on. One of the things that we have to focus on, as I mentioned before, is the problem of egocentric thinking and then its sister, the problem of sociocentric thinking. Now, these can be taken as separate concepts, and that's because they're not exactly the same, of course, but there is a lot of overlap between them. And one way to begin to look at this is to understand the human mind as having natural egocentric and sociocentric tendencies, while naturally also developing some intellectual skills, and yet at the same time requiring the active cultivation of intellectual traits or virtues, ethical sensitivities, and many intellectual skills. So what I'm saying here is that the mind does, of course, naturally develop some intellectual skills. In other words, the mind does naturally think critically to some degree. Everyone at some time or at some times does think critically, but maybe not enough, or maybe very little. And yet, the human mind is also naturally inclined frequently toward egocentric and sociocentric thinking. Again, egocentric thinking being thinking which is really, it's thinking which is trapped within itself, unable to see other points of view, unable to think within any other perspectives, at least while being egocentric. And the egocentric mind can also be selfish. So selfishness is an easy concept for anyone to understand, because I can ask you this: do you know anyone who is selfish? And you will say yes. And I will say, well, just think about how that person acts when he or she is being selfish. Now, if I said, can you think of someone who is selfish? And you say yes. And I say, did you think of yourself first? How many of you will admit that the selfish person that you thought of was yourself first? That tells you something in itself. So, selfishness or rigidity of mind, closed-mindedness, all of these traits, bigotry, prejudice, bias, all of those happen in the minds of humans. All of us engage in these. But it seems that when you're thinking within your own mind, which is the only way you can think, it seems that you are the one who has the right way of thinking. So when we think in this way, it's I am the way, the truth, and the light. And I know everything, and you know nothing. Now you can imagine some people that you've met who are very pushy with their selfishness, or I'm sorry, with their with their narrow-mindedness. In other words, they take their narrow views and they keep trying to convince you to change. And you know some people who are they think that they're always right all the time, no matter what. These are people that you would call hard-headed. That's all coming from egocentric thinking. And obviously, humans do not learn to be egocentric. We are naturally skilled and inclined toward self-deception, which is the mechanism, the primary mechanism, as far as I can tell, for both egocentric and sociocentric thinking. So we deceive ourselves into thinking that there's nothing wrong with our thinking. So if I'm being completely closed-minded, I'm telling myself all the reasons why I am correct and this other person is wrong. And I may be in that process including information that actually is correct. I'm convincing myself with this correct information. But what if I'm leaving out information that is also relevant? And by leaving it out, I can deceive myself into thinking that I'm correct. And by focusing on the parts of the argument on the other side that possibly are flawed, and not focusing on the parts of the other argument that are not flawed, again, I can avoid seeing reality. This is done every day by people across the world. And so we've got to have command of our egocentric nature. And there's a lot more in this, but that's a beginning place. Again, the related set of tendencies in the mind to egocentric thinking can be categorized under the term sociocentric thinking. So where egocentric thinking is selfish, again, sociocentric thinking is looking out for the desires of the group, to protect the group. You could say, well, there's nothing wrong with protecting your group. Well, there's nothing wrong with protecting your group as long as by doing so you're not violating the rights and needs of someone else. That's the question. There's nothing wrong with pursuing your own desires as long as you're not violating the rights of someone else. It all boils down to this: are you denying someone or a sentient creature a right that they should naturally have? A right that they should have by their very nature. So sociocentric thinking is focusing on getting more for our group, and often that means more for it could be our family, and that obviously we have to be concerned about our families. Just because you're protecting your family and providing for them does not mean you're being sociocentric. The question is, how do you act in the family in relationship to those outside of the family? And we can be sociocentric in terms of the way we perceive our nation, or the way we think of our gender. When people say, women are like this, we women are like this, what does that mean? You can't lump all women together except in very basic terms of definition. And so that means that that understanding how we function in groups is very complex. But one thing we have to be careful of is not to violate other people's rights as we're functioning in groups. So if joining together is going to harm someone else, then that's going to be a problem. And now, the other part of sociocentric thinking, other than, let's say, group selfishness or groupishness, is the parallel to egocentric rigidity of mind, and it will be sociocentric rigidity of mind, thinking within the logic of our group and not being able to imagine any other logic being relevant to helping us reason better. So we're locked into this way of thinking. We validate one another in our groups. We don't let people in who don't agree with our ideas. Um, and so you can think of many examples of this historically in your own life, because these problems, the problem of egocentric and sociocentric thinking, are pervasive throughout human life, and they cannot be left out of any rich or substantive or robust conception of critical thinking. Because it's not enough to just teach students the elements of reasoning and the intellectual standards and even the intellectual virtues, because they will be using these and using them well in many cases, and thinking that now they are the critical thinker. And what happens is that they develop in that process very often intellectual arrogance. They think that they know more than they do know. And that is often related to, well, it is coming from either their egocentric or their sociocentric thinking, or a combination of both. So if we do not teach these concepts of egocentric and sociocentric thinking directly, we're really not going to be able to achieve our goal of advancing critical thinking across human societies, because we'll be thinking that we're doing it when actually we're not. And so these are not just psychological and sociological concepts. They're direct barriers to critical thinking. And anything that's a direct barrier to critical thinking must be included in its theory. To take this a bit further, and I've already said much of this, but imagine that you're seeing the world on a daily basis. You're looking at the world, but you're looking at the world. You're looking at what's happening in the world, what happens to you through lenses. And these lenses are based in the egocentric and sociocentric thinking frequently. So we're looking through the lenses of our biases, our distortions, we're projecting onto other people what we ourselves are doing. One of the defense mechanisms. Rationalization, rationalizing my behavior even though there's some kind of problem with it that I don't want to see. Giving reasons why I'm doing what I'm doing, which may be perfectly good reasons, but they're not the real reason. All kinds of fallacies exist in human thinking, and these form part of our lenses. Egocentric pathologies, sociocentric pathologies, selfishness, groupishness, prejudice, bias, etc. So if you're looking at the world through these lenses, if our students are looking at the world through these lenses, then how will critical thinking help them break through that? Well, there is only one way that I know of, and that is to teach the toolbox of critical thinking. And that toolbox of critical thinking I have pointed out a couple of times, but in closing, let me remind you of these, that we have the problems I've just been focusing on of egocentric and sociocentric thinking that serve as primary barriers to the cultivation of intellectual traits, which in dispositions and virtues, and that is our main focus for critical thinking, because we need to create a world which embodies fair-mindedness and critical thinking. So we want to develop the ethical and the intellectual character of the human species, and we do that one classroom at a time, one teacher at a time, one student at a time. And I will end with this quote by William Graham Sumner from Folkways, 1906. The critical habit of thought, if usual in society, will pervade all its mores, because it is a way of taking up the problems of life. Men educated in it cannot be stampeded by stump orators. They're slow to believe. They can hold things as possible or probable in all degrees, without certainty and without pain. They can wait for evidence and weigh evidence, uninfluenced by the emphasis or confidence with which assertions are made on one side or the other. They can resist appeals to their dearest prejudices and all kinds of cajolery. Education in the critical faculty is the only education of which it can be truly said that it makes good citizens. So with that, thank you for joining me, and I hope that you have benefited from this very brief introduction to critical thinking. Thank you.